Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for joining this evening's webinar on debating hosted by YouthPolitics UK. You are all very welcome, and we hope to see you at future events as well. So today's focus is going to be on debating, and this is going to form part of our political discourse series. This is the second component. First off, we started off with campaigning, where we introduced you to the mechanics of campaigning. How do you run a campaign? What sort of things do you need to think of? And that was extremely successful, and we had really good feedback. So we're continuing the series with the debating workshop, where we're going to teach you the ins and outs of how to win a debate, how to strategize a debate, sort of content you should include, and the winning strategies you can do to really win a debate. Now, there are sort of two elements in debating, sort of features. You have your classic debating, which is just you and your mates, when that's coming into normal political matters. It could be about anything, and everything we talk about today will be applicable to those sort of scenarios. But we'll also be touching a little bit on competitive debating as well. So those are more competition-based debates, where you will be entering maybe as a team or maybe as an individual. And what we're going to try and do is give you the skills needed to really win a debate. So Sam, if you could click at the next slide, that would be fantastic. So first of all, just a bit of an introduction to YouthPolitics UK. Provide a bit of background about who we are and what we do. We're an award-winning non-profit organisation that initially started in Manchester, founded by young people. And we've now expanded into Edinburgh and London, and we're nationwide now. We're completely youth-led from the core, run by young people for young people. And what we do is we empower young people to ensure that they have the skills just like this necessary to engage in political discourse. So you're here at the right place if you're looking to develop those sort of skills. Just a few sort of notes of housekeeping before we start properly. This webinar is being recorded, so just to let you know, you are going to have a chance to ask questions at the end. If there's anything that you have throughout this webinar that you just want to pick up on, any points that you want to make, just send them across. There's a Q&A function, and one of our team will be monitoring that, and then let me know when you've asked a question. Now, if you want to ask that question live, which we can do, where we can come over to you and you can ask your question or make a point or anything you want to do, just put live next to your question, and it'd be really great to hear from you, so it's not just me rambling on the entire time, which my team will tell you I have a tendency to do. So that would be fantastic. My name, by the way, is Daniel Laws. I'm the Chief Executive of YouthPolitics UK, and it's really great to see you here. So without further ado, we're going to get stuck in with the workshop, and if you have any questions, any points throughout, there are going to be some interactive elements. By interactive, I mean, normally if I was doing this workshop with a classroom, you would all be up and I'd be getting you to do it face to face. Fortunately, we can't really do that here because we have so many people joining us this evening and we're doing it as a webinar format. However, there will be points throughout this where I'm going to be saying, look, this is how you formulate a really good point. Do you want to try and do it yourself? Now, we're not going to come to you live for that, but if you want to put a point or anything like that in the chat function, what would be great to do is I can then read that aloud, and we can see if we're sort of getting the gist of everything. So what I'm going to do first is just do a bit of a short introduction to debating as a concept, because I think it's something which is really misjudged and misperceived in society. Was often seen as reserved for a very privileged few, and one thing that I was desperate to do when I first founded YouthPolitics UK was ensure that those skills are accessible to absolutely everyone. They're not that hard to develop, but they just need a bit of practice. So what is debating? It's an activity in which we examine ideas and policies with the aim of persuading people within an organised structure. So what you've probably seen throughout the modern political discourse, certainly elements of it, is that we're starting to lose that organised structure. What we want to try and do at YouthPolitics is make sure that we are able to examine ideas without offending people with personal attacks, but rather make some structured points which really persuade people. And I'll just consider the world around us by thinking about different arguments. So often in debating competitions, you're often asked to debate something which you really don't believe in. So I was asked to debate against the idea of tackling climate change once. And so you're really going to have to think about things that you are strongly opposed to. But what that allows you then to do is really cement your own view. So it's a really useful sort of exercise to really find out what you believe, but also to develop what you believe as you go forward. and it's about speaking strategically. Now, what I really want to get across is that this isn't just useful for debating, let's say in competitions or around the pub. What it's useful for is everything from interviews to presentations to being on stage in drama productions. These are skills that you're going to need throughout your life. You know, if you talk to CEOs and employers, which we do quite a lot of youth politics, what they will tell you is that the market's now moving away from, you know, classic, you know, the skills that you would have thought, you know, a few decades back were really, you know, of paramount importance, and now they're moving over to soft skills. So how can you deal with people? How do you communicate? They're really important features of you as an individual that you need to develop in order to survive in the workplace and thrive there. Now, debate programs, you will see, have made leaders because they require intelligence, vision, empathy, efficiency, and resolve. All those elements are desperately needed, not only debating, but in the world as a whole. So what you often see is that, you know, prime ministers, and there's multiple reasons for this, but prime ministers and CEOs and the rest of it have all gone through debate programs at some point in their life. They all have experience with it. So what we want to do is training up the next generation is ensure that you guys have these skills and are able to develop them. So we could kick us off, Sam, with the third slide. That would be fantastic. So what we're going to do is focus on three things, and what I do during these workshops is split them into three core parts, which I think are definitely worth having a look at separately. So the first thing is content. Now, I'm a huge fan of putting that first. I think content really does matter about what we say and the arguments and the examples that we use. And we're going to go through, what does content mean? What does it mean to make a good point? Second of all, we're going to talk about strategy. So how well can we engage with the topic? How can we respond to other people's arguments? And how do we structure what we say? And the third thing is going to be style. So we're actually going to run some more public speaking workshops in the future, which definitely keep an eye out for, which are going to dive into rhetoric a bit more. But what I want to do is have a look at how can you develop a rhetoric which complements your debating style. So I think that will be really, really interesting for you guys to have a look at today, but also keep in touch with for the future. It's not going to be as comprehensive as an in-person webinar, but I'm really hoping that we can sort of replicate it now, and that, you know, you'll be able to come to future in-person sort of discussions where we can really sort of engage with one another, because that's what debating is all about. But here we go. Let's start off with content. So okay, so we're going to go through the basics of what should be included in a debate. In every debate, there's a motion. Okay, so this is a statement, idea, or policy that's disputed and framed, normally within the prefix of this house. So usually the motion is either a policy which changes the status quo. So don't know, the status quo is what's happening now. You know, what's the current trajectory of policy. So for example, this house will provide all police officers with firearms. Okay, so that's against the status quo, because, you know, not all police officers in the UK have firearms. But obviously that's drawing a distinction with the US there, and it's saying, you know, now we want to introduce a policy in which every single police officer has a firearm. So, you know, that goes into the category of changing status quo, or it's a statement which is, you know, either true or falsehood, which is examined in a debate. Okay, so this is quite important as well, because this happens quite a lot, as well. It says this house believes that cats are better than dogs. Okay, that's a very simplified version. It gets to the point of what we're saying. You know, it's saying that something is better than something. So those are the two core features you normally get in a debate, and that's in a competitive scenario, but also in real life as well. You know, that you can normally boil down a traditional debate into those two sort of categories. Now, there are often two sides to the debate, as we all know, the government and the opposition. So this is both in real life in Parliament, but also in proper competitive debating. What you have is you have someone, you know, framed as the government, which is the proposition. So they're proposing that everyone should provide police officers with firearms. And then you've got the opposition, which of course opposes the motion. Now, in competitive debating, you normally have four teams of two all against each other, but that sort of changes. But what I'm going to try and do is make sure that this is pretty comprehensive in scope, because I'm pretty wide ranging, because you're all going to be joining from different abilities, that sort of stuff. So this is going to be hopefully really applicable for those who are really advanced debaters, but also those who are just being introduced to it now. So yeah, let's move on. Okay, so throughout this, what I usually like to do is frame the entire workshop around emotion. Now, we're going to do that a little less today, but I still want to do it to a degree. So today's going to be this house believes that previous generations are responsible for leaving us a world worse off. So that's quite a long motion. It's quite a wordy motion, but it's one which I think is really applicable now to quite a few competitions are doing that across the country, this motion, but also I think it's a really good one for us as youth politics start thinking about. You often hear in the news young people claiming that, other generations have made it so we're a lost generation, whether that's to do with the failure to combat climate change or just recently with the education policies. But also, it's thinking, who do we blame for current issues? Do we blame ourselves to a degree? We're going to explore that in a bit during the strategy session. We're actually picking apart the motion. But please keep this motion in your minds. Start thinking now if you can. This is a really good exercise. Start thinking of 3 points. If you were given this motion now, and often you're only given 5 minutes to actually prepare. For your actual debate, sometimes it's that small. Trying to think of 3 points now, very quickly, that would be applicable to this debate. Choose whether you want to be government or opposition, and just go for it. Whatever you believe, actually, do the opposite. I think that's a really cool exercise. Start thinking in your head and write down 3 points that you would make. And it's often, I like to think of it sometimes as just I don't know whether you guys would like to think of it like this, but as an essay. So I'm a history student, so if I'm given an essay topic, you automatically think of 3 points. And you can often tell who are debaters because they think in a very structured manner. They go, first of all, believe this, second of all, believe this, third of all, believe this. And that's really useful for essay writing as well. Really useful for just in general, structuring how you think. So start thinking of 3 points for that. And once you do that, we'll move on to the next slide. So we're going to move on to content. So we're going to start off with this. Now, like I said before, I think that content is the most important part. I think that when you have judges in competitive debating, this is what they look at the most. They really listen. We're going to talk about listening later. They really listen to what the points you make. So, please don't, in this current political climate where, people often think that style is everything, let's try and return. This has all been about the political discourse, but let's try and return the political discourse back to, meaningful speeches and actual points that mean stuff. That would be really nice if that happened. So preamble. Okay, so we're going to structure this in 4 parts. First of all, you have the preamble. Now, most speeches start with this stylized sort of opening sentence. They sort of, there's 2 things here. First of all, make it clear what you're arguing. And then second of all, highlight the problem that the debate's trying to solve. Give direction to the rest of the speech's heading. Now, I'll talk about that later in the case divide. But in the preamble, you've really got to start engaging people. And this is going to complement the style section. So start thinking, try and link the preamble to the style section. Try and think of a really gripping opening sentence. But I'm very aware that people often say, think of a gripping opening sentence, and you don't really know what that means. That's where the style section is going to come in. But, really, the best way of doing this is making your point clear. But maybe starting off, I like to start off personally with a stat, which really shocks people. And if you can do that, I think that's really, that's really powerful. So you can start off with a really powerful stat. I don't like quotes. I wouldn't start with a quote. Start with a stat and then really draw the audience in by saying, this is why the House today is proposing that we should introduce firearms for all police officers. So this is why our generation have been left worse off by previous generations. That's really how you should structure your start. Give context to the debate. So again, like you would almost like I would in a history essay, but like you probably would as well, you've got to say what are sort of the main arguments that have been considered from both sides. Why is this debate relevant now? But why is your argument relevant now as well? You've really got to make sure that you justify that the problem needs solving. That's something which many debaters don't do. First of all, is there a problem? How pertinent is that problem? And why is your solution to solving it right now? You're not going to get all of that in the preamble, but what you should be able to do is make sure that you're setting the foundations for the rest of the actual speech. Now we're going to move over to the case divide now. Now the case divide, if we just move to the next slide, here we go. It's telling the judge what your main arguments are going to be. So again, this is right at the start of your speech. So you've got preamble and then the case divide. Now, some people intertwine it within the preamble, but I like to just do it towards the end. What I personally think is really important to do is ensure that the audience, because you might know what you're saying and what you're arguing in your head, but a lot of the audience won't. This will be the first time they're hearing these arguments. So what they want is a nice structure, almost like I did at the start, where I said, okay, we're going to be splitting this session into 3 parts. I told you what those 3 parts are, so you know what to expect. Do that in your debate. Say, first of all, I'm going to be arguing this. I'm going to be arguing blah, 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 because this. Second of all, I'm going to be arguing this. Third of all, I'm going to be arguing this. And then I'll be reaching the judgment that, and there you go. That's a really good case divide. Keep it simple, but it's like, again, yeah, introducing the main paragraphs almost in an essay. Be clear. First, I think I'm going to say this. Second, I'm going to say this. And third, I'm going to say this. Now, that's, again, in competitive debating, is very relevant for that. But also, it's really, really useful when you're just chatting to people, when you're chatting to friends. Say, you know, not chatting to friends, but when you're chatting, when you're trying to persuade them of something, say, look, you know, I'm going to make this point, but first I'm going to say this. Second of all, I'm going to say this. Third of all, I'm going to say this. And that's then going to lead to the final point, that whatever you're arguing. Now we're going to jump into the main parts of the speech, which are the arguments and the rebuttals. We're going to talk about rebutting a bit later on. But this is where you make your case or attack someone else's. So, you know, within an argument, you've really got to make sure you give clear analysis. We're going to talk about that in the strategy section, that links to the motion and explain why you win. Okay, so the very, very simple way of doing this is just going for a simple, again, you might have heard of this in school, is just doing your point, your evidence, your explanation, your link. Now that seems really basic, but it's the most effective way to persuading someone and really diving in. Always see debating as if you're in a pool, and if you've dropped something in the pool, you're diving in to try and find it. That's what you're doing with debating. You're making a general point, and then you're diving in and analyzing and focusing in on the core points that you're making. So make your point. State that very obviously at the start, then use your evidence. We're going to talk about how to use evidence in a bit. Then you're going to make an explanation. Why is that evidence relevant to this debate? First of all, use evidence that actually justifies that there's a problem in the first place. Then use the evidence to suggest that your solution is the solution to solve it, and then make your link back. Okay, and that links back again to the case divide. You're making your point, and then you're repeating it again at the end. And that's really, really important. Make sure the audience know what you're saying. Now, again, in terms of numbers, I always say 3 arguments are really good. It depends how long you have. If you are in a competitive debating scenario, and let's say you have 5 minutes, then that's where I'd only make sort of 2 points, especially if you're introducing the debate. You'd make your point, and then I'd only go for 2. If you've got longer, if you've got, for example, now an hour workshop, or if you've got if you've got about half an hour to make a good point, maybe even 15 minutes, you could do it in 10 if you really wanted. 3 solid points, but the key here, and this is what judges look for, is, are you justifying your point? Are you really diving into the analytical points? Because it's so easy to say something. It's so easy to say Brexit is wrong. Okay, that's a basic thing you're stating there, that the entire population could say if they wanted. The next part is saying why. Why is it wrong? You know, use your evidence, use your explanation, and then link it back. And really dive in analytically. And then you finish off. Jump to the next slide. You finish off with stating your point again. Be clear, be concise, and be relevant. Now, I always like to deliver a powerful punchline, and in that punchline, make sure that there's no doubt. So what debaters like to do is, which debaters who don't necessarily win like to do, is add loads of nuance, when in reality what judges look for, and what's often much easier in life to do, but this is probably should be seen in isolation of for competitive debating, is pick a side and stick to it. Okay, if you're in a competitive debating scenario, pick a side. Okay, you know, if you're given climate change, policy shouldn't be enacted to tackle climate change, which is a bizarre stance, but it happens quite a bit. Stick to it. and just go, no policies should be adopted. Or if you think that dogs are better than cats, go all the way. Say that they're better than cats in every scenario. You know, they're better pets, they're better animals, all the rest of it. Don't add nuance to it. Don't say, but in this scenario. In competitive debating, just go for it. Now, in real life, you might want to add a bit more nuance, but yeah, that's quite specific. But anyway, state your point and always go for a straightforward argument. That's really crucial. We jump to the next slide. Okay, now we're going to dive in a bit more here, because I know that that's sort of content which you can find, you know, which quite a few sort of debating and youth organisations talk about. But, you know, we at Youth Politics like to dive a bit deep and give you some more skills. Now, these are, we're going to go for 2 core points here. First of all is mechanisms. So in debating sort of speak, this is where you prove how and why your claim is true. Now, this is especially true in the UK circuit. There's a big emphasis on proof and sophisticated analysis. So mechanisms are basically linking to that evidence point. So if you're arguing that there's a housing crisis amongst a generation, can you prove it? Do you have the mechanisms to prove it? So if you ever hear that term mechanisms, you'll now know what it means. It's a simple way of saying, please evidence every claim you make. Now, that's not just the initial point that you make, stating, you know, that previous generations are responsible for leaving us worse off. Point 1, because of a housing crisis. It's also throughout that. So first of all, you've got to say that there's a housing crisis, justify that with evidence. Second of all, you've got to try and prove that past generations are responsible for leaving you that housing crisis. Don't just say that, you know, that's just very rhetoric heavy. Why are they responsible for that? Every single point that you make that needs to be backed up by evidence, back it up with evidence, because otherwise the judges really will catch you out. And I think that, you know, journalists need to do a better job in the modern day. There are a few who do it very well. Andrew Neil for sure does it very well, where they pick up on false claims or claims that aren't backed up with proper evidence. And mechanisms is how you do it. And then we're going to move on to the next sort of point there, which is impact. So once you've sort of talked about mechanisms, then think about impact. So after proving why your argument is true through the use of mechanisms, the next step is proving why it's important. So if you've proven that there's a housing crisis, why should people care? Okay, what impact does it have on young people's lives? This is where I want you to be much more emotive. Okay, you've made your factual statement. You've shown why that's so important for the judges and for the public to consider, or just your mates at the pub. The next part, okay, is saying what impact does it have, and really make the case for why your argument is strong. Now, you know, there's been quite a good analysis of partisan sides in terms of what the left need to do better to debate, what the right need to do, just in general political discourse. And one thing that they found was that the telling of stories has been really powerful, because you're measuring and you're conveying that impact. For example, just again, youth politics is non-partisan, so we're not taking sides. But what you can do from an analysis is see that the clicks on, for example, Daily Mail articles or the likes, talking about benefit fraud, especially, you know, saying, you know, maybe immigrants are taking much more benefits, this in their eyes, than they should be. And they'd normally tell the story. They say, like, mum of 6 from said country takes this. And that's emotive language, and they're doing that within the impact here. So they're saying, you know, we have a problem with the benefit system, and they're pointing it to this and saying that you should care about this. Now, the left, they've analysed, Owen Jones has said this quite a lot, they need to learn how to tell better stories. You know, they need to tell how to actually measure and convey that impact. So please, guys, when you're thinking about debating, you need to get those 2 things in good proportion. First of all, think about what are the mechanisms you're using, what are the, you know, what sort of evidence you're using to back up the points. But then second of all, think about the impact. Why should people care about the points that you're making? And once you've got those 2 things sorted, complemented by the style section that we're going to talk about in a bit, then you're really onto something. If we just move on, that'd be great. So now we're going to move on to strategy. So I hope that's okay with content. If you want to keep putting points in, my team will take a look. I'm sure feedback to me. But that's pretty much the content section sorted. We are now going to move on to strategy. And now you know, there are quite a few different strategies that you can do in debating. Again, we're going to be looking at competitive debating as well as just casual debating. So hopefully these strategies will be will complement each other in any scenario. So let's talk about strategy first. Brilliant. Okay, so this is one I like to do quite a lot, and I know a lot of debaters in the circuit like to do it. And again, it is incredibly relevant to even if you're just having a debate which isn't in a competitive scenario, and that is defining the motion. Now, a lot of people just think that defining the motion is saying, it's just, you know, clarifying what they think, clarifying what the judges think the motion should say, when in reality what you can do as a debater, if you're very cheeky and you do it well, is define the motion in your favor. We're going to talk about that in a little sec, but what do we mean by defining the motion? So I've told you what a motion is. Okay, so it's like, this house believes, let's keep it really simple, that cats are better than dogs. Okay, now defining that motion is looking at those words in isolation, looking at those words individually and saying, okay, what do they mean? You know, what are we saying when we mean better? So we're zooming in on the better there. And we're saying, okay, this house believes that cats are better than dogs. You know, what does it mean by better? Are we saying that they're better pets? Are we saying that they're better dancers or a more superior animal in general? So I hope you can see there that there are numerous definitions there or ways that you could frame the debate by just looking and analysing the word better. And if you're a clever debater, what you can do before you start is saying, this house believes that cats are better than dogs, and it will take the interpretation, or we will be defining better as better pets. Okay, and then you can you know, use that throughout the trajectory of your debate to really complement your arguments. Now, there are some situations and some circuits which don't really like that, and you gotta sort of look at that. But the majority, you know, you can do that really well, and it's so useful for sort of casual debate. So if we're looking at the second point here, you know, it's really good to just focus in on the words in particular. So this house believes that previous generations are responsible for leaving us a world worse off. You know, you sort of think, what sort of words there need clarification? I think there was quite a few. If you guys just want to, the chat function is available. If you wanted to just type the words that you think needs clarifying. If you were a debater and you were given this motion, what would you sort of pick up on? What sort of words there do you think you would need to define, and how would you sort of define it? So any of those sort of suggestions would be brilliant. Yeah, no, really good point there. Previous. So I'd go, okay, previous generations is so vague. Are we going back to the Tudors, or are we talking post-war generations? Tarrant, brilliant point there. Worse, and Georgia. Okay, they're all coming through now. You guys get the gist. Responsible, previous, worse. They all really need clarifying. But what you can do, I hope you can see, is that you can frame the debate the way that you want to. So the motion is there, ready for you to pick it apart and use it to your advantage if you're the government. So saying that this house believes that previous generations, I would define instantly as post-war generations, or in particular, I think a few people have mentioned baby boomers. You can say the generations in particular are responsible for leaving us a world worse off. Okay, what is responsibility? You know, it's a really big concept that political philosophers have debated with, but you've got to try and, you know, condense it maybe into a 5-second little statement about what you think responsibility means. And worse off, what does worse off mean? Does worse off, you know, mean economically? Does it mean, you know, in terms of resources? Does it mean happiness? But, you know, what does it mean when it means worse off? And you've got to define that. If you don't, then, you know, that leaves a lot of room for your opposition. But if you do, and you do it well, my word, you're in a really favourable position. Now, this is really, again, useful when people make bold statements. If people make bold statements and say, you know, let's say reverse, if a youngster stood up and said, previous generations are responsible for leaving us a world worse off. An adult, if they're, you know, really analytical and, you know, they dive into that statement, you know, they'd go, hang on, it's not our generation that done it, it's another generation. Or they'd say, you know, what do you mean by responsible? You know, how can you hold one demographic responsible for something that's, you know, structural, or has, you know, has their origins in different sort of sectors? And worse off, you know, what do you actually mean worse off? You have better technology than we do. You know, you've got more opportunities than we could ever dream of. So that's what, you know, an adult debater who disagreed with this motion would pick up on. So I hope that that one's been pretty useful. There are quite a few more strategies that we'll go through. Second one, I'm just looking at you guys are amazing. You know what to do. Those comments are absolutely fantastic. Plan ahead. So there are arguments that are simply stronger than other arguments, and they carry more weight in a debate, and that's really important to understand. Not all points will be seen as equal to one another. So there are points that are going to hold more weight, but you've got to justify why they hold more weight. It might seem really obvious. So, for example, in this debate that we're talking about, climate change could be a huge part, and that has the potential to be an incredible point, but you've really got to justify why it's an incredible point. I like to think of it almost as Pokemon debating. So, which one of your arguments are you going to throw against someone else's arguments that will trump it? So, if you're really smart and in competitive debating, you don't have too much time, but you can sort of think about what arguments are they going to be putting forward. Okay, what sort of arguments are they going to be thinking of? If you were in their positions, what 3 points would you be making? Think of them and then partner them up with your debates and think in advance of what your rebuttal is going to be. We'll talk about rebuttal in a second, but really try and match up your debating points to their debating points and really see which ones carry more weight. But again, justify why they carry more weight. And then, look, I think there's someone who does this extremely well in the current political climate, objectively, which is Keir Starmer. I don't know if many of you have seen this. Some of you who are really politically engaged will have seen this. What he does is he punches not literally, he puts the opposition into a corner in which, they either do one of two things. They either argue something that's contradictory to what they have said before, which was pretty evident with Boris Johnson and the government when they distributed evidence and they disagreed with that evidence, and then Starmer whipped out the fact that was government evidence. That's a really, really decent way of doing it. Or they really try and invalidate their argument. That links to that first point there. If you make it as if the opposition are arguing something that is actually something that they've argued before, if you know what I mean, then that really invalidates their current argument. So, Keir Starmer does that very well, and I would, look at his sort of debating style. It's really interesting looking at the current PMQs. They're recessed now, but do take a look at their PMQs, because what you do have are two very distinct debating styles going up against one another. And what you can do, this is what I like to do all the time, is pick up on what you think works well for certain people and try and incorporate that within your own sort of tactics and your own method of debating, and you'll soon see that you develop and you can sort of test things out. Some will work, some won't work. We'll go on to the next slide if you could please, Simon. Okay, so the next point is tag team. You can do this as a strategy. So work with another member to dismantle an opposition's arguments. In competitive debating, this is so true. But if you can get an ally, maybe in a casual debate with your family, whether that's a sibling or choose one of your parents to try and make a statement with you, this would work as well. So, think about what arguments complement each other, what arguments belong together. So if I was in a pair, I would say, okay, I want these arguments to be together because they just make sense being together. And which arguments are suited to combat which. So if you find that the government, if you're in opposition, you find that the government are making two big points, you might say, hang on a second, I want to take these 2 points because that directly contradicts what the government is saying. So really got to communicate with your team partner, and it has the potential to be really effective if done well. Now, this is where it plays an even bigger role when you're in a team. Play to strengths. So do certain arguments suit your speaking style? So when I've observed debates taking part, or even when I've judged debates, what I've found is that the best debates are often ones where two people have maybe, let's say, different debating styles to add a bit of variety, but they really complement each other. And I think this is really evident in British politics as well, and in American politics, where you have two people that really complement each other. In the UK, a really good example of that was Blair and Brown. You have Blair, who was very emotive, very rhetoric heavy, using all the hand gestures, rallying the nation behind his beliefs. Then you have Brown, he was brilliant with rhetoric, but he was more factual in the sense that he followed what we were talking about before. He did more mechanisms than impact. And that was a really effective combo, one as Chancellor and one as PM. Now, you could look to the US, for example, and see that again. You could see Obama-Biden as a fantastic example, and even Biden-Kamala Harris. But, you know, Obama-Biden was an example, again, of that emotive, rhetoric-heavy speaker. And he has some fantastic sort of tactics, which we could, you know, spend a whole workshop dissecting. But that, again, complemented the more calming Joe Biden, who was more, they used to say that he was the hugger, he was the very much more, you know, subtle in sort of comments. He's raising that up now. But again, I hope you can see there's some really nice ways of complementing each other. Let's move on. Okay, but this, I have to say, is the greatest strategy, and any debater will tell you this. In order to be a really good debater, yes, you have to be able to make arguments. Yes, you have to be able to persuade people. But the way you do that is by listening to your opposition. You cannot rebut points and you cannot persuade people if you're not listening to what they're saying. If you cannot empathize with their point of view, or at least understand what they're saying, you're going to be in a really weak position to win over them, win over the people watching, and win over the judges. So, you know, when you're debating, for the most part, you should be listening. And whilst you're listening, again, structure your points, but really listen to what they're saying. Because if you listen, you can do this next part. You can do the rebuttal. So, you know, this is really important. You can state, rebuttal is basically explaining an argument that contradicts the opponent's or is somehow mutually exclusive to it. So it attacks the underlying logic of an opponent's argument, so it no longer stands on its own. So if you really listen to what they're saying, they will hopefully, you know, they'll make their main point, but now hopefully we've given you the skills to actually really dive into it. You know, do it as almost like you were speaking. So you've got your main point, but then are they going into any more depth? Are they providing mechanism? Are they backing it up with evidence? If they're not, rebut it straight away. Then are they measuring the impact of it? If they're not, rebut that. Now, what they might do is give inaccurate features on both. They might give inaccurate evidence or provide, you know, evidence that doesn't justify the main point, or their impact may be disproportionate to the point they're making. So now we've run through what actually makes the content of your speech, you can now analyze how do you rebut the content of the opposition speech, and that's really crucial. Now, this is a more unique approach, and this is something to do if you feel much more comfortable with the classic rebuttal, and this is identifying the links in an argument. So what links are weak in a debater speech? And you've got to explain why they're weak. So, you know, you could say, you know, a lot of people say point A is this, and that then means that point B is this. And you might think, hang on a second, that doesn't equate that. You know, there are really big weaknesses throughout the arguments that you're making. You know, the first point might be valid, but then that, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean this, or the evidence doesn't back up the fact that the main point is valid. You know, so think, you know, you've got your classic rebuttal where you're stating that, you know, something is contradictory to what they're saying, or just you know, defeating the underlying logic of an opponent's argument. But, you know, think about the links as well. That's a really good tactic, which I think can be really effective if done well. Jump to the next slide. Now we're going to focus finally on style. We're going to leave hopefully some time for a few questions. But style in recent years has gained a lot of traction, but, you know, it's something which can, and Simon Lancaster, the speechwriter, says a lot about this, and we're hopefully getting him in to do a public speaking session, is, you know, you can win over an audience with, you know, unfortunately 70 to 80% style. You can make people believe things, and you only have to look at modern day politics to show this, through using techniques. And, you know, if you analyze orators, you know, throughout history, right from Cicero, you know, all the way to now, there are tactics that you can use with regards to style, which really help complement your debating style, the content. And if you can do these things well, you know, you really can persuade people of a lot of things, which can be an incredible tool to have, but in some cases a pretty dangerous one. So what I'm going to do is show you a few that have been proven psychologically to have a really big impact, and if you incorporate them within your speech, could be really, really effective. So let's get straight into it. So the power of three. Now, this is one that you'll hear all the time. It's something that I constantly do in speeches and debates, which is And they're actually really effective at the start and at the end of a point. And they really are complemented if you repeat keywords throughout. Please don't underestimate the impact of this. It sounds really simple, but if you analyze speeches throughout history, I promise you, you will find the power of three in there somewhere. You know, a really obvious example here is we shall fight them on the beaches, we shall fight them on the landing grounds, and we shall fight them in the fields and in the streets. What have you got there? You've got three key points, which are really, really effective. You've got the repetition of shall in there, which adds that more sort of determination, that rallying effect of we shall. But you've got the power of three there. And, you know, again, I challenge you, go look at some of the most powerful speeches. You know, Obama has said, yes, we can 3 times. Thatcher said no 3 times. Tony Blair said education, education, education. You know, that everything circles around the power of 3, and that's because it has a psychological impact on people. People have been shown to be more persuaded when you say 3 clear points. It's a really weird thing, but it does work really effectively. Next slide. Thank you. Developing your style. So I was going to go to this at the end, but I think we'll do it now. So, you know, throughout this, think about, you know, what are your strengths? You know, are you too emotive in what you're saying? That was me 2 years ago, probably is still me now, is that I'm quite rhetoric heavy. I know that. But then you've got to think, you know, how can I sort of adapt that? How can I alter my debating style? And that's where you've really got to, again, listen to your peers, listen to judges, see how you can incorporate it, incorporate that feedback into what you're saying. Keep practicing. So really put yourself forward into sort of debating competitions. It can be scary at times, and I know that. I was at the age of 12, I was shoved into a debating competition and I didn't have a clue what I was doing, but it was so useful in developing your skills. Keep coming to YouthPolitics workshops. We've got some partners there. I'll talk about them and some more workshops we're doing, and enter competitions. But yeah, let's keep going for your style. There's some other points I want to touch on before we finish. Okay, so we've got three breathings, right? I'll do this from the top of my head. Here we go. We've got 3 breaths. Okay, so what they do now is there's a really effective tactic where you can say right at the start of your speech 3 really breathless sentences, where it could be, let's say you're trying to persuade your parent to get you a puppy. It could be, Dad, I want a puppy. Okay, now that might not seem too effective now, but when you do that in a political aspect, what it's shown to do is really engage the audience, because there's a sound of danger. Okay, and what that sound of danger does is it really intrigues the audience, and really makes them listen all of a sudden. So if you can make 3 breathless sentences at the start, that's really effective. Another one which is really peculiar is rhyme. So if you can rhyme at the end of your speech, this is better for long speeches. So I would recommend this when you have, you know, if you're given a platform, you know, to speak for a good 20 minutes, at the end you can introduce a rhyme, which, you know, don't make it really cringy, but just a subtle rhyme at the end has been proven to sound more trustworthy. Okay, which is really strange, but audiences apparently respond better when there is a rhyme there. They think it's more true. And the final one is metaphor. Okay, metaphor is really important. You know, it's something which can be used really well. You know, I think, you know, the comparisons to tackling COVID as a war has been really effective, because then it allows you to introduce policies and create the mindset in citizens, you know, that they need to protect others because it is a war scenario. They need to stand up their civic duty because it is a war. And that metaphor is really effective, but it can also be used negatively. For example, think of like, okay, the Calais jungle. I think that's a really prominent example, which sadly, you know, demonizes sort of refugees. If you think about it, you know, what are they implying when they say the Calais jungle? They're implying that those within the jungle are animals. They're dehumanizing those there. So metaphor, I hope you can see there, can be really, really effective too. And the final point I wanted to make on style is, you know, I can often tell, you know, you can often see who's going to win a debate, you know, not always, but sometimes, before it's really started. And that's quite an interesting point to make. But, you know, think about how you conduct yourself as an individual. You know, as you're entering the room, shake hands, right, with your opposition, really engage with them, eye contact, introduce yourself to judges if you're doing it in competitive scenario, stand tall, okay, maintain that eye contact throughout, be confident, firm handshake, because that holds a lot of power. It'll make you feel much more confident. It might intimidate in a really weird way, even though you're being really nice, the opposition, because you seem much more confident. But what we want to do at Youth Politics is make sure that, you know, sort of every young person can go into a debating scenario or make a point with that sort of confidence. So what I want to do really briefly as well is bring in an old friend of mine who is a fantastic debater, one of the best in the UK, I would say. She's called Jess Molyneux, and she was our head of training since our foundations. And I really want her to do, if that's okay, Jess. Jess, are you there? Can you hear me? Oh, I think we need to unmute you. Hey, can you hear me okay?
Hello,
oh my God, I haven't seen you in ages. So, Jess, I was wondering if you could just, because I know you're very active in the debating network, what would be the next stage? We have quite a few people who are still logged on. What would be the next stages for them if they've come away from this workshop and they've developed those new skills, want to test it out, or just want to jump in straight away? You know, what sort of tips could you give them?
Yeah, sure. So since I've got to uni, haven't been as much involved in the university circuit, but was very heavily involved on the school circuit, which I imagine is everyone here sixth form, year 10, 11 age-ish. So hopefully these tips will be helpful for kind of that period. It's one of the hobbies that I enjoyed absolutely the most, and I think it really, like, you make some great friends doing competitive debating, and it opens up a lot of doors for you. So I think the first thing to do would be, if there's a debating society at your school or your sixth form, like, join it, and try and encourage others to join it if it's not that big. And if there isn't one, then I would say, like, start your own. You need 4 people ideally to start a debating society. 4 regulars, like up to 8 regulars is great, because then you can do a full BP British parliamentary style debate. And I would say advertise it with posters, start with interesting motions. I would say put out the idea that people can watch to start with, rather than having to participate. I think you get better attendance then, and maybe find a few friends who are ready to kind of get going to start with straight away. I think obviously, like with COVID, we've seen how well things can work online. So if there are people here who want to start debating societies at their individual colleges or schools, but don't have enough people joining up individually, then you could always do a Zoom link between 2 schools. I think that could be quite fun and interesting to explore the possibilities for that, with points of information via the chat. I think that, so I'm currently working at the Cambridge Union, and we're exploring some cool possibilities for how we can incorporate technology into traditional debating style. So that's quite cool. If you have your debating society at school, you've been practicing with Dan's tips regularly, you've got used to the kind of British parliamentary format, what you can do is start going to debating competitions. So every university across the country will host a debating competition for schools one weekend throughout the year. So if you go, if you just search the uni competition 2020/21, then you'll be able to find when they're hosting their event. It'll usually be on a Saturday. Some schools and colleges will be able to fund registration fees, and if your school and college can't do that, if you get in touch with the university, then they're usually able to subsidise it. And then it's just a case of, also Manchester definitely does one, which I think the registration fee is quite low, and their travel costs will be quite low to get there. Warwick, Birmingham also do them, and Nottingham are all really good ones. If you want to go a bit further afield, there's London, do a lot of debating competitions. Some really good ones to start with are Nottingham, and also St Paul's Girls' School Open and Eton Open, because they're all novice competitions. So if you're just getting started, it's a bit less scary. But also, any competition you go to, you will be you'll be put in a room with people who are your ability after the first round, based on the score that you got. And so don't be too worried about going to a debating competition and it being really hard all the way throughout the day, because you'll be matched with people who are kind of your level of ability. I'd say one tip I have for competitive debating competitions is find yourself a reliable partner whose style you work well with, and if you're lucky enough to find someone in your debating society at school with that. So I used to debate with my twin sister, for example. I was very lucky, but it is quite easy to find a partner that once you've practiced with them a few times, they can you get into the swing of each other's style, and you know that when you plan in your prep time together that one person's going to say something, that you can trust that they will say it, and that can boost your confidence. Another competition you can get involved in, which is more long speech format and long prep, so involves more research than kind of short prep, which university competitions do, is the ESU MACE and the ESU public speaking competition, depending on your ages. The ESU MACE is one of the most prestigious debating competitions for schools in the UK, and it's the oldest one, and it's very exciting. There are regional rounds, and then you progress to like regional finals, national finals, and then a grand final, and that's a really fun one to do because you can get involved at any level. So even if you get knocked out in your regional round, it's still really good practice. So I learned so much about, I did emotional private military companies. I know like absolutely zero about war or strategy or like just like global war politics, and I learned so much about how that works. So that's a really good one if you're more interested in doing your research, and that one starts, I think, around the start of the academic year. You sign up, and I think it's kind of October, November that the first rounds happen, and then the final is in March, and it's kind of in progress across the year.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Jess. I'm really sorry. Can you stay though, because we've got loads of questions that we need to fire through, and I know that I'm going to need your help with a few. Guys, just to make a quick announcement, we are going to go till about 5 past. I hope that isn't a trouble for you guys, but we really want to answer some of your questions. I told you that I'm rhetoric heavy. I do ramble on a little bit, but hopefully we can get through some of your questions now. And Jess, there's some really good ones here. This one's a really good one from Georgia, who's 17, said, when you're debating in a casual situation and someone uses personal attacks to try and emphasize their point, what's the best way to respond? Well, I'd first of all say that, highlight the fact that it's not emphasizing their point by making a personal attack. It's the classic criticize all you want with Thatcher, but she did make a statement that, as soon as someone starts throwing personal attacks, they've lost the debate. Now you can even quote that statement in itself, because what it does show when someone makes personal attacks is they can't resort to, or they're not able to in some form use that. You remember when we talked about using debating as making points in a structured format? They're really struggling to do that. And I think that you should take that as a compliment, that you're sort of trumping them on that front. Now, it's quite hard when someone throws it, but, in a competitive debate, I'll be interested to hear Jess's brief thoughts on this. Sometimes people don't intend to. Sometimes it's quite heated and they say something and you might call them out on it, and do call them out on it. First time, very polite, call them out on it politely first. They might then backtrack very quickly saying, I'm so sorry. And even in a casual debate, I'd hope that they do that. They don't, then you've really got to call them out on it and just emphasize that point that, again, if I was looking at your question there, Georgia, it would be saying, it doesn't emphasize their point. It really doesn't. And I think people around you would be able to see that if you're trying to win over friends. Jess, what would your point be on that?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you said. I think in a competitive debating context, it just won't wash with the judges. So as long as you flag that, like, that's a personal attack, then the judges, like, it just won't count as a point. So you can trust university judges to be fair, and also that's something that you should definitely flag in a competitive debate environment with the equity officers at the competition, because that's just not acceptable to do. And if it makes you feel like, if it knocks your confidence or makes you feel not okay in that setting, then that's not fair, and it affects your debate skills. I would say in a casual setting, obviously a lot harder because you've not got like a responsible mediator necessarily, but I would say that, like, keeping your cool, although it's really difficult to do, is the best way to, like, just not rise into debate and not arguing with them if that's the level that they're going to stoop to. I would say, okay, like, I'm going to end the debate here if we're being reduced to that level, and then do a kind of closing statement about why your argument was so great on a logical and not personal attack level, and then I'd remove myself from the situation, I think.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Jess. Okay, we've had one come through which is actually a really good one. Concerning debates about topics such as civil rights and equality, how do you respectively tell another person that it's simply not their place to comment on a certain topic due to a lack of first-hand experience? Okay, this is a really good one, isn't it, Jess? Because I think this comes up quite a lot, especially on stuff about discrimination and policies that could be perceived as discriminatory. I know stuff like stop and search is a classic one for this. This is where we talk about the balance between mechanisms and impact. I would really then go for pushing the impact a lot. If you're a person who has, so there are two ways of looking at this. If you're a person who has experienced this, you can only convey your sort of experiences there. If you're trying to say that none of us, and this is what I would do in this scenario, if let's say it's stop and search, and neither of us are within that demographic that would be affected by that disproportionately, I would do something. I wouldn't say you're not, I would say we're not. You know, I'd include myself in that, to really open up that debate. And I quite like to use the we quite a lot in debates. I like to make it seem as though we have more common ground than what we dispute. So in that scenario, I would say, look, we, both of us, simply don't have the experience, not necessarily not to comment on it. I think that's an interesting thing in your question. You know, I think everyone sort of deserves sort of, you know, some degree of having a comment on something, but say that, you know, look, you don't truly understand or you can't truly comprehend the impacts of certain policies. Jess, what would you say to that one?
Yeah, I think it's such a good and a tricky question. I think one that anyone who wants to debate any kind of social justice issues is continually dealing with, however good they are at debating, because the fact is that you will just argue with some people who think they know the best about everything and haven't researched the issue. And like, I think the difficult thing about social justice is that the more you research an issue that applies to a group that you're not in, the more you realise how much you don't know and how that's not part of your lived experience. And actually, if someone is kind of being ignorant and hasn't done any research into it, then it's easy for them to think that they know about it. If they've not come to that point of, oh, actually, I've done research on this, but that's made me realise how little I know and how unqualified I am to speak on this. So I think Dan's point about using the we, about saying like, we're on the same page here and neither of us can fully understand that experience. But I think at the same time, maybe trying to relate it to how would you feel if so-and-so so pick up on an identity category or a demographic that they're in and say, how would you feel if so-and-so who isn't in that same category as you tried to comment on this, and relate it to something that they can maybe see if they were on the receiving end. So for example, like, I think I find a helpful one is if I'm in feminist spaces where people aren't like also sensitive to race issues or think that they're qualified to comment on race issues when they're like not people of colour. One thing you can say is, well, like, how would you feel if a man tried to comment on this particular way that patriarchy manifests itself, and compare that to the way that white supremacism or whatever it is manifests in a way that they can relate to. Hopefully that makes sense.
Thanks so much, Jess. And we're going to go for a final one. I know there are quite a few questions coming through, and what we'll do is what we do as usual. And if we haven't been able to answer your question today, what I've tried to do is sort of pick questions here which are, you know, which have been asked a few times just in different ways. If we haven't, and you feel like we haven't, what we'll do is we'll look back and we'll come up with some answers and we'll write it down and distribute it to you guys after the workshop. Okay, Jess, are you ready for a tough one? Okay, this is from Chris, 17, and it's a really good one. How do I win over a friendly debate where we've reached a point of fundamental ideological contention? So, for example, in one about social progress, we have to, you know, we've thoroughly fleshed out our views, boiling it down to individualism, collectivism, so like pretty much political philosophy, and we're getting deeply philosophical about human nature, slightly going off the point. You know, how do we win over a friendly debate? Or I think is relevant to competitive debating, don't you, Jess, where there's like a fundamental ideological contention. I will be very honest, I'll leave that one up to you because I don't know the answer.
So I think in a competitive debate setting, like the idea is that there will sometimes be, they will be split along, a debate will sometimes be split along ideological lines. Sometimes it will be like both sides want to be progressive rather than conservative, and so there shouldn't be an ideological divide. But yeah, sometimes it will be a right versus left motion, just as in a casual setting. I think like one of the things that you have to remember is that in real life debates, like, no one adjudicates, no one judges, and no one says that this is the thing that we have decided and this is the thing that society should implement, because politics and ideology is in a lot of ways a matter of opinion. Obviously there are some aspects of that people claim as ideology that are actually like not up for debate about people's rights, but in the vast majority of cases, like, to be a good debater, you do have to realise that you're debating your point of view for a reason, but other people have equally good reasons to debate their point of view. So I think if you can get to a point of mutual understanding and see where the other person is coming from and why they hold those views, but you don't believe that's just not the way you see the world, then agreeing to disagree is the only strategy I can think of. And that does only work when the other person's engaging in good faith. So if you say, okay, like, you're for the individual, I'm for the collective, let's leave it there, and they say, no, well, I think you should be for the individual, then that's just really frustrating. And I'm not sure how you deal with those kinds of people, but I think most people will say, okay, cool, if you show that you've understood their point and listened to them rather than trying to shout them down, then most people should be fine with that.
Yes. Yeah, no, and I'll just add one final thing to that, which is something which I've had a little think about it. Something which I would do in that sort of scenario, and which happens a lot, especially during policy discussions, when we're trying to win over political figures who subscribe to a particular ideology, is try and make the case, and you've got to try and do this effectively, try and say, okay, look, in both ideological camps, they would still agree with this proposition because, okay? And what you can try and do there is, there's never anyone in conservative philosophy who agrees that everything, agrees on everything about everything, okay? Even in conservative philosophy, there will be disagreements. So, for example, what I do in policy discussions is, I've done this once very, explicitly, would say to a conservative MP, look, it makes sense for conservatives to want to promote political education in schools in order to promote an active citizenship, in order to ensure that democracy is stable for future generations. To try, if you can, and I know it's difficult, especially in social scenarios, but try and link their philosophy to the point you're making, because I'm sure in an Venn diagram there will be times when you can get something in the middle in which both traditionally liberal or socialist thinkers and conservative thinkers, you might be able to argue they might be from different points of view, but they might lead to the same policy. So that's quite difficult, but if you can, that could be really effective. It won't work in all cases, but fingers crossed it will in some. Right, so I think that's enough questions for now. Thank you so much to everyone who asked one. We keep getting them coming through. Maybe if Jess is available over the next few weeks, she can work with me to try and answer them. But thank you so much, Jess, for joining us. What we're going to do now is quickly advertise the third and final part to our political discourse series, and it's called the News Literacy Workshop, and it's in coordination and collaboration with Shout Out UK, who are an incredible partner organisation who work to promote political literacy across schools and across young people. So that will be happening on the 1st of September at 7 o'clock. I'm told that bookings are now live, so you can go and book that last one. If you enjoyed today's and you came to the campaigning one as well, fingers crossed you know what to expect. Hopefully they've been really useful to you, and I know that this news literacy one will be really will be really helpful, because what it'll do is it'll help you analyze modern day media, social media, political media, and really get to the grips of what's happening, and therefore how you can respond. So I'd really recommend you sign up to that one. It would be great to see you again. Please do stay in touch with Youth Politics and all of our work. We have all of our social media handles there, which we would love you to sign up to, because we have loads of updates about future events, future workshops, all the different updates about what we're doing in the policy world, in addition to how you can get involved, because we'd love to see you again. Please feel free to email us at info@youthpolitics.org.uk, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Sign up to our newsletter. Every week we send out an incredible newsletter. Once a month we send that out. And please consider writing an article for us. We have an incredible articles team who would love to hear from you if you've got a point of view. If you want to test out these debating skills, but through the writing form, because a lot of the things we talked about today will be applicable through argumentative and opinion articles. So if you want to test that out, please do email us. But what are we on? We're on 8:10. So thank you so much for everyone who's joined us. I hope you've learned something. Do send us any feedback if you think we could do anything differently, or if there's anything you particularly enjoyed. And I really hope to see you soon. And thanks, Jess, for joining us.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Dan, for organising. Great to see.
Bye, everyone.